introduce an amazing person that has joined us as well, Farzad Fallah. Farzad, you're a compliance executive at BAT, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, inter alia.
Australia, because you're also a huge fan of moot courts, that I know for sure. And you're an activist and an international lawyer, an amazing lawyer, in fact, who has been introduced to us by Anja, who's also on the call with us. And you've been with us for COVID-19. You've been contributing to all these databases entries, and you've been with us, making us laugh and introducing the fun to the group. So thank you for being part of that collaboration, and I hope that we'll be collaborating also in the future.
Thank you, Anja. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very glad to be here today. I like to think that I have one thing common with President Obama, and that is that he used to take very long pauses in speaking. So for that, I would apologize in advance. The topic I'm going to talk about today for a short period of time is, let's call it a synthesis between international disaster management law and, thank you, Anja, a synthesis between international disaster management law and international solidarity as part of human rights. Just recently, we submitted a paper with my supervisor addressing the same issue, in which it was our argument that there is actually a profound link between what we call the law governing international disasters, with all of its implications, and international solidarity as a basis for realization of all human rights for all people around the world. On the first step, I would like to draw your attention to one specific point of interest for me personally. During the last couple of months, since the COVID-19 pandemic has started, the common phrase used by all UN officials, including in all agencies, that actually reveals the fact that such a pandemic requires a multifaceted response, has been international cooperation and solidarity, starting from the Secretary General in very early stages, all the way to the UN High Commission of Human Rights, the independent expert on international solidarity, the General Assembly, and of course, most importantly, the UN Security Council, which went on to call for a global ceasefire on all fronts, so as to be able to address the issue of the pandemic in a more comprehensive and coordinated manner. But what does it mean, international solidarity? Well, I'm sure most of you know that the principle of cooperation is a rather old and ancient and one of the very basics of the current and contemporary international law. It is a rather abstract notion. It realizes its manifestation in practice. Needless to say, that might be a characteristic of any rule of law which reveals itself in abstract and manifests itself through practice, through real measures, countermeasures, policies, judicial decisions, and so on and so forth. But what is the additional aspect of international solidarity in comparison to international cooperation? You could argue that they're quite similar. That would be a reasonable thing to say. But international solidarity, as when it emerged in the 70s, in the late 70s, as a third generation of human rights, calls for further and more comprehensive action and increasing the aspects and the audience, so that is to say those who receive the right or towards which the right is manifested, and that is a mutual relationship. The stakeholders in international cooperation as a rule of international law is mostly defined as a state-oriented principle, while on the other hand, international solidarity increases the scope of stakeholders and actors, so long as to even call upon the civil society, or let's say non-governmental bodies, to play a role. On top of that note, and so as to give meaning to this short speech, we need to look at in which situations does international solidarity as a form or as an equivalent or as even a contradiction to international cooperation come into play. Well, it might be various situations. What I've chosen for this speech specifically is the realm of international disasters, or to be more precise, international disaster management law. To be able to provide a basis to create this synthesis or this link between international solidarity and international disaster management law, I would argue that the first step is to be able to realize, what does it legally mean, disaster? In that respect, the literature is rather clear and, as usual, much more progressive than what is atoned to by the international ship of states, let's say the international group of states. It goes back a long way. It is a couple of decades old at the moment. And it did not come into play for international disasters as a comprehensive regime of international law until just recently, when the International Law Commission started its work on the protection of person in the event of disaster. But before that, we did have international instruments such as the Tampere Convention on communication in the event of disaster, and some instruments provided by non-governmental bodies, most importantly being the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Without further delay, a disaster as it stands in international law means a calamitous event or a series of events which results in loss of life, widespread loss of life, or environmental damage, and large-scale material loss, and thereby damaging and effectively and seriously disrupting the functioning of society. As you see, the definition is rather broad in its scope. You can literally put anything in it. Well, of course, there are reservations to the scope of application of that definition. One being that it does not apply to armed conflicts, and for good reason, but that requires another speech and it might be relevant to the current topic today. The important threshold here, though, is to take note of the social impact of a disaster. And bear in mind, it doesn't matter whether a disaster is man-made or natural. The point is that if we have an earthquake in the middle of an ocean without having any impact on any civil population, we wouldn't deem that as a disaster in the international legal sense. That is an important thing to remember when qualifying situations as deserving to be looked at through the lens of international disaster management law. I guess that some of you or all of you might be arguing in your heads at the moment whether the current pandemic would qualify as a disaster. Well, I would give you the answer that it is at least my position looking at the literature and trying to qualify the situation in the legal sense, that of course the current pandemic does qualify as a disaster. As I referred to that brief paper we submitted just recently, back at the end of July, looking at the records, the numbers affected by the pandemic were 17 million confirmed cases and around 700,000 deaths. In doing research for this speech, honestly, this morning, I took note that the latest report by the World Health Organization notes that on October 16th, that is 3 days ago, 39 million confirmed cases have been noted by the organization and reported. And that's more than twice since the end of July. And the death toll is actually, at the moment, above 1 million. Therefore, it is safe to assume that it has resulted in widespread loss of life. And as we all know, this is, I think, rather self-evident, that it has created a lot of socioeconomic impacts and disruptions throughout the world, the effects of which are going to be dealt with for a while in the future as well. But what is the problem here? Why does not the framework of international disaster management law come into manifestation as much as you would think that it should? There are, of course, numerous factors in that respect, one of which being political. The other one, which is of more interest to me, is the legal questions. Well, international disaster management law note that all stakeholders, including states and international organizations and the civil society, have the liberty to make offers for humanitarian assistance in the event of a disaster. So far, so good. But the problem is that those receiving offers of assistance under international law are under an obligation to respond to them expeditiously and not withdraw their consent arbitrarily, which I think has been happening. I can think of at least a couple of examples of my own country refusing to receive assistance from the United States. In my view, that does qualify as a breach of international disaster management law as it stands in its binding form. But to draw the conclusion at the final stages, and I see that I don't have much time left, what are we seeking when we try to provide a conjuncture between international solidarity and disasters? Well, disasters is one of the most notable situations in which you have to demonstrate international solidarity as a basis of preserving sustainability in international relations, especially in economic matters, and providing good coexistence and principles of good neighborness and the sort. In other words, although this is a third generation right in the sense of human rights, being in much contrast to the manifestation of the first and the second generation of human rights, being the examples of which being the 1966 covenants on civil and political rights and social, economic, and cultural rights. The international community is currently, I argue, and I claim, under a concrete obligation to give a helping hand to all of those suffering at the moment. But bear in mind, we are better prepared than 1918 when the Spanish flu happened. We are more capable technologically. We are richer than ever, although inequality is at its highest as well. But this is a call that on multiple frontiers, we're inviting all stakeholders to lend a hand to the situation which would benefit all. And it is my claim in this very, very short speech that international solidarity as a principle and a rule of international law should be a beacon and guide all stakeholders relevant to the issue in providing assistance with best intentions. To conclude, I prepared this quotation from Nelson Mandela, God rest his soul, if you are a believer. And I quote, "One of the challenges of our time is to reinstall in the consciousness of our people that sense of human solidarity, of being in the world for one another and because of and through others is a beacon." With that note, I would give the floor to any questions. Looking forward to some provocative points here. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzad. That was amazing and very much timely presented. You took exactly 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That does not happen very often. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I would invite the public to actually provide any questions. If you have any, you can unmute yourself or drop it into the chat. My biggest question would be, what is the research that you do? I mean, how does one evaluate whether the cooperation is actually being done well or where is room for improvement? How do we identify the points where we could strategically be better?
Yeah, sure. One survey which is of interest to me personally is looking at the history of a certain issue. When the discussions in the International Law Commission was going on, and the special rapporteur of the UN on the protection of persons in the event of disaster was carrying out his study of the matter, there were a number of states who were very expeditiously arguing that diseases would not qualify as disasters. Well, then you would ask why. My observation is that, and bearing in mind some doctrines going on in the theory of international relations at the moment, the conundrum, the dilemma, the balance, the unstrikable balance between human rights and sovereignty is something which reveals itself over and over again. States do not, apparently, in my view, do not like, first of all, to give much access to outsiders by their very nature, apparently. So when there is offers of assistance, I think that most states take them cautiously and with a bit of restraint. And I think, in my view, that doesn't make sense at all. Making everything about security issues or political points is going to help anybody in the long run. So I would say that this fetish, this fascination with state sovereignty is also part of the problem and part of the question here. And it does manifest itself in various ways, in refusing an offer of assistance, in taking a political debate between, for instance, the United States and China into the Security Council and making it a power game. You would argue that there is a problem with the implementation of the legal framework. That is what I can think of at the moment.
And what's the solution to that? I mean, fostering the cooperation between states, like you said, it is one thing, absolutely right. But do you see new multi-stakeholders? Because you did say that the solidarity is actually the one that brings into the play a lot of different stakeholders. It's no longer just about the states. It's possibly even about the private sector coming together, and even more so the bottom-up approach. So all of us can be part of that. But do you see that happening? I mean, there's what enables us? How do you observe that we are all now coming together? Is that also happening, or should we actually push forward with that?
Well, with a bit of skepticism, I would say that it does happen. The most notable example being, and that bear in mind, I referred to that, the work of the International Law Commission in my speech. it is one of the most rare instruments of application in peacetime that you would see a clear reference, an explicit reference to, for instance, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent and the International Federation, which form a part of the civil society response to such situations. You could argue that they are such of magnitude and structural strength that you can see similarities between them and international organizations. But nonetheless, they do form a part of the bottom-up approach. And my research so far reveals that, at least in certain situations in which we are facing with catastrophical circumstances, facing with drought, climate change, armed conflict, and now on top of each other, the pandemic, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent are playing a vital role, for instance, in Yemen. Very simply, I would be able to tell you that, yeah, if you have a few dollars on your shelf, donate to these organizations. But that's not all. That would be looking at it in a very restrictive sense. I witnessed that, for example, in some parts of the United States, the civil society is calling for helping local businesses. Yes, you could argue that that is a rather, in comparison in its magnitude, very different from what the UN does and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I don't think we should devalue that. That is part of the response that we are witnessing to the current situation. And I think it should be cherished greatly and disseminated. But to make a policy point on this, I argue that there are several instruments pending adoption by the states as being the most important and powerful stakeholders in this respect. I would argue that if you are a policymaker, if you have influence over your politicians and over your legislatures or your executive and so on and so forth, make a call to convince these stakeholders to take these into account, even if they don't want to adopt, for instance, the ILC draft articles as a treaty. The local and national implementation of that instrument does not require the formalistic implications of the international legal system. But I would argue that adopting them and implementing them can be a turning point for what we are dealing with at the moment.
Thank you so much. We do have a question from SMA Abdullahi.
Yeah, that's my colleague and very, very dear friend.
So how one can balance the sovereign rights of states? Here. We have many questions. How we can balance the sovereign rights?
Jesus, the next one is my fiance. I specifically told these people not to ask questions.
Great to have you, Laura, here. So do you want to go first with your fiance's questions, or do you want to go first with Abdullahi questions?
No, that's up to you. You've taken it up to be the moderator kindly, so you make the call.
How can one balance the sovereign rights of states to manage disaster based on all relevant circumstances, such as national interests, etc., and its obligations based on the international solidarity to receive assistance, cooperation, etc., from other states for the best interest of its own people?
My dear God, that is a PhD of international law asking that question. Okay, I would answer it very minimally. And I hope you would agree with me that a concept of national interest, as Martikos Keniemi has argued at least, has remained in the discretion of the state. It has become a legal concept with a political content. That is to say, in other words, that determining national interest has remained discretionary and arbitrarily in the hands of the state. So maybe in the most academic theoretical sense, an attempt to scrutinize a concept such as national interest can play a role in answering that question of striking a balance between international human rights law and state sovereignty. That is what I can think of, but that is, of course, a very good question. And I invite all to think of it and share your views with me on this occasion or the other. That's all. Thank you.
That's great. I mean, the balances are striking, or at least hard to achieve. And then the second question is, in your opinion, what are the biggest reasons for the international community not expressing solidarity and fulfilling their obligations to act in solidarity, be it giving or receiving the aid? That's an incredible question, because we were actually thinking about these same things while we were creating the model provisions for the UNESCO. It's been quite obvious that to some extent, I mean, countries are willing to share their resources, for example, but far too often have we actually seen them closing the borders and saying, hey, we won't be providing you with all the resources and we're only going to be spending them for our own very citizens. Yeah. Our very own citizens. And then proceeding with a comment, I'm thinking of reasons like panicking about the state's own resources, exactly, surging nationalism, etc. It's ironic that the defining feature of a catastrophe is that it is a sudden tragic event, and the rationale for international regulation is to be able to prepare for that in advance. When a catastrophe like this happens, the immediate reaction is far from solidarity. Maybe it's also a question of magnitude. Maybe a pandemic is too big for the international community to stay calm about, and that's why we're resorted in abandoning our agreements. A very good comment, Laura. Thank you so much.
Yes, I would say that's a very good comment. And of course, I'm not a political commentator, but as you, Laura, have rightly noted, and you're going to give me credit for this answer later, without making any political stance on anything here, the rise of self-isolation policies, or like the tendency to focus within and to internalize and to exclude, in some areas understandable, is probably demonstrating itself also in this situation. I mean, to give a relatively legal answer as well, the legal regime at the moment, in order to provide assistance, in order to qualify as a state as deserving to receive assistance, does not make the condition that a disaster should overwhelm their national response. And this is true about many states, that their national response, although shrinking, is still capable of giving a response. In other words, some states are, let's say, rapidly moving towards further collapse, and some are dealing with it. But nonetheless, on both sides of the spectrum, I would think that the implementation of certain socio-political ideologies is revealing itself as certain, like taking those states back from giving lending a helping hand to the international community, as I argue, as we would like them to do. But yes, I think that's a valid point. That's a profound observation. But nonetheless, I don't think the answer to that lies in the international legal regime at the moment. In fact, I would say that the whole point of this speech is to give a call to utilize the capacity of the international legal regime to address the challenges of a global nature. In other words, I'm making the claim that although we're talking about the future of law, and in some aspects, I would say that it's probable that we need to reinstate and revisit what we have already, which we're not utilizing to the best of our benefit. So yes, thank you for that comment. That is the response I have to it.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Did that make sense?
It does, actually, a lot. I hope, Laura, you can also have or give us some comments on that. Maybe stay in the chat, stay with us. We're actually going to be welcoming our new speaker, Žiga Perović. Farzad, thank you so much for taking the time and leading us through the disaster management for crisis, or not really for crisis, but in international law. If you have any more questions, please stay connected. We do have Farzad in our Future Law WhatsApp group, so if you have any questions, just shoot it there. I do believe that Farzad is going to be very happy of them, and he's going to be providing you with all the answers possible.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.